Chapter 58. Let us now leave Mademoiselle Danglars and her friend on their way to Brussels and return to the poor Andrea Cavalcanti, whose rise to fortune had been so disastrously interrupted. Notwithstanding his youth, Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti was an intelligent and resourceful man. As we have seen, at the first sign of disturbance in the salon, he had begun to inch his way toward the door, walked through two other rooms, and finally vanished from the house. One detail which we have forgotten to mention, but which not ought not to be omitted, is that one of the two rooms he walked through was the room in which the bride-to-be's trousseau and jewels were on display. Andrea showed his foresight by seizing the most valuable of these riches as he passed. They made him feel much more light-hearted as he leaped out the window and slipped past the gendarmes. Once outside, he ran for a quarter of an hour, not knowing where he was going, but wishing to put as much distance as possible between himself and the place where he had almost been arrested. He stopped out of breath at the end of the Rue Lafayette. He was completely alone. Then he saw a cab approaching. He hailed it and asked the driver, "Is your horse tired?" "Tired," replied the driver. "He hasn't done anything all day long. Only 4 customers and 20 sous in tips, 7 francs in all, and I have to give 6 of it to the owner. Would you like to earn 20 francs more?" "I'd be glad to. What do I have to do?" "I want to overtake one of my friends with whom I'm going hunting tomorrow. He was to wait for me in his cabriolet till 7:30. It's midnight now, so he probably got tired of waiting for me and went off without me. Will you try to catch up with him?" "I'd like nothing better." Andrea climbed in, and the cab set off at a rapid pace. They never caught up with the imaginary friend, of course, but from time to time Andrea would ask a passerby if he had seen a green cabriolet drawn by a bay horse, and since 9/10 of all cabriolets are green, information poured in from all sides. It had always just been seen passing by. "Faster, faster," cried Andrea. "We can't be far behind it now," and the poor horse kept up its desperate pace until they had left Paris and arrived at Louvre. "I can see now I'm not going to catch up with my friend, and I'll kill your horse if I go on any further," said Andrea. "I'd better stop here. Here's your money. I'll spend the night in the Hotel de Cheval Rouge and take the first carriage I can get tomorrow morning. Good night." After handing the driver the money, Andrea leaped nimbly down to the pavement. The driver headed back toward Paris, and Andrea pretended to go into the Hotel Rue Cheval Rouge. But after standing before the door until the cab was out of sight, he walked rapidly on down the road until he had covered 2 more leagues. Then he stopped, not from fatigue, but because he had to think carefully and devise a plan. Taking a stagecoach was out of the question, because a passport would be necessary for that. It was also out of the question to remain in the vicinity of Paris, which is one of the most closely patrolled regions of France. He sat down by the roadside and thought. 10 minutes later, he had made his decision. He sprinkled dust over one side of the overcoat he had had time to take from the antechamber and button over his evening clothes. Then he walked on until he came to the Chapelle and Serval and knocked boldly on the door of the local inn. The innkeeper came to the door. "I was thrown off my horse on the way from Montfontaine to Senlis," said Andrea. "I must get back to Compiègne tonight, or my family will seriously be worried about me. Do you have a horse I could rent?" The innkeeper called his stable boy and told him to saddle a horse. Then he woke up his son, a boy of 7, and instructed him to ride behind the gentleman and bring back the horse. Andrea gave the innkeeper 20 francs. As he drew out the money, a calling card fell to the floor. It was the card of one of his recently acquired Paris friends. When the innkeeper picked it up after Andrea's departure, he was therefore convinced he had rented his horse to Monsieur de Mauleon, 25 Rue Saint Dominique. By 4 o'clock in the morning, Andrea had arrived in Compiègne. He sent the innkeeper's son back with the horse and knocked on the door of the Hotel de la Cloche et de la Boutique, reflecting that, before going any further, he would do well to fortify himself with a good supper and some sleep. A servant came to the door. "I'm coming from St. Jean au Bois, where I had dinner," said Andrea. "I intended to take the stagecoach that passes at midnight, but I lost my way like a fool, and I've been wandering around the forest for 4 hours. Let me have a room and bring me a cold chicken and a bottle of Bordeaux." The chicken was fresh, the wine was old, the fire was clear and sparkling, and Andrea surprised himself by eating with as much appetite as though nothing had happened. Then he went to bed and almost immediately sank into that deep sleep which a young man of 20 always finds, even when he is filled with remorse. However, we must admit that, although Andrea might well have been filled with remorse, he actually had none. Here is the plan he had devised, and which was responsible for the greater part of his feeling of security. He would get up at dawn, leave the hotel after scrupulously paying his bill, go into the forest and buy the hospitality of some peasant on the pretext that he was a painter. Then he would procure an axe and the costume of a woodsman and travel from forest to forest until he reached the nearest frontier, walking at night, sleeping during the day, and approaching inhabited places only from time to time in order to buy food. Once across the border, he would sell his diamonds, which ought to bring him somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 francs. Furthermore, he counted heavily on Danglars' desire to hush up their misadventure as much as possible. It was for these reasons, aside from his fatigue, that Andrea went to sleep so quickly and slept so soundly. In order not to oversleep, he left the shutters open and contented himself with bolting his door and laying out on the table beside his bed a certain very sharp knife whose temper he knew well and which never left him. At about 7 o'clock the next morning, he was awakened by a ray of sunlight shining in his face. As soon as he opened his eyes, he knew he had slept too long. He leaped out of bed and ran over to the window. A gendarme was crossing the courtyard. Another one was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and a third, on horseback and holding a musket in his hand, was guarding the door to the courtyard, the only door through which it was possible to leave. "They've come for me," was Andrea's first thought. He looked frantically around him. The windows of his room opened onto an outside gallery which was perfectly visible from far below. "I'm lost," was his second thought. Indeed, for a man in Andrea's situation, an arrest was equivalent to a death sentence. For an instant, he convulsively pressed his head between his hands. During that instant, he almost went mad with fear. But soon a hope-giving thought came to him, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. He looked around. The objects he sought were all together on the writing desk: a pen, some ink, and a sheet of paper. Forcing his hand to be steady, he wrote the following lines: "I have no money to pay my bill, but I am not a dishonest man. I am leaving this tie pin as a pledge. It is worth at least 10 times the amount of my bill. Please excuse me for leaving at dawn. I am ashamed." He pulled the pin from his cravat and laid it on top of the note. This done, he drew the bolt of the door, left it slightly ajar as though he had left the room without locking it, then began to climb up the chimney like a man accustomed to that kind of gymnastic exercise. At that very moment, the first gendarme was walking up the stairs, accompanied by a police commissary. Here are the circumstances that led to that visit which Andrea was preparing so carefully to receive. At dawn, the telegraph had begun sending messages in all directions. As soon as each locality was notified, it sent out its authorities in search of the murderer of Caderousse. Compiègne, a royal residence and a fortified town, is abundantly supplied with gendarmes and police commissaries. The search had therefore begun as soon as the telegraphic order was received. The Hôtel de la Cloche et de la Beauté was the largest hotel in town. It was naturally the first to be visited. When the gendarme, who was a brigadier, and the police commissary arrived at Andrea's door, they found it half open. "Aha," said the brigadier. "An open door is a bad sign. I'd rather find it locked with 3 bolts." Indeed, the note and the tie pin left behind by Andrea confirmed the sad truth. He was gone. But the brigadier was not a man to yield to one piece of evidence. He looked under the bed, behind the curtains, inside the closet, and finally stopped before the fireplace. Thanks to Andrea's precautions, there was not a single trace of his passage in the ashes. Nevertheless, it was an exit, and under the circumstances, every exit deserved careful investigation. The brigadier had some straw and wood brought to him, stuffed the fireplace with it, and set it on fire. A dark column of smoke rose up to the sky, but the brigadier did not see anyone fall into the fireplace as he had expected. Andrea, who had been in conflict with society ever since his childhood, was at least as resourceful as a gendarme, even a gendarme who had attained the respectable rank of brigadier. Foreseeing the fire, he had climbed out onto the roof and was lying flattened out beside the chimney. For an instant, he had hopes of being saved, for he heard the brigadier call down to the 2 gendarmes who had remained outside, "He's not here!" But when he cautiously raised his head, he saw that instead of withdrawing after this announcement, the 2 gendarmes had, on the contrary, doubled their vigilance. He looked around him at the Hôtel de Ville. A colossal 16th century building rose up like a somber rampart to his right. Every part of the roof was visible from its windows. Andrea realized that he would soon see the brigadier's face appear at one of those windows. He therefore resolved to go back, down, into the hotel through another chimney. He looked until he saw a chimney from which no smoke was coming, crawled across the roof to it, and climbed down into it without being seen by anyone. An instant later, a little window of the Hôtel de Ville opened and revealed the face of the brigadier. It remained motionless for a time, then disappeared with a sigh of disappointment. The brigadier, as calm and dignified as the law he represented, walked through the crowd gathered in the square without answering any of their countless questions and went back into the hotel. "Well?" asked the 2 gendarmes. "He must have left early this morning," replied the brigadier. "But we'll have the road to Vieille-Coutray watched, and we'll have a search made in the forest. We're sure to catch him there." The brigadier had hardly finished his sentence when a long shriek of fright, accompanied by the violent ringing of a bell, resounded through the courtyard. "What's that?" cried the brigadier. "There's a guest who seems to be in quite a hurry," said the innkeeper. "From what room are they ringing?" "From number 3, replied the servant. Who's staying in number 3? Asked the brigadier. The young man who arrived with his sister last night and asked for a room with 2 beds. Once again, the bell began to ring desperately. Follow me, cried the brigadier to the commissary. And you outside there, shoot if he tries to escape. According to the telegraph, he's a desperate criminal. The brigadier and the commissary ran up the stairs, followed by the uproar which the revelation concerning Andrea had brought forth from the crowd outside. Andrea had skillfully climbed 2/3 of the way down the chimney, but at that point his foot slipped, and despite the support of his hands, he had descended with much greater speed and noise than he wished. This would not have mattered if the room had been empty, but as luck would have it, it was inhabited. 2 women were sleeping when they were awakened by the noise. They stared at the fireplace from which the noise had come and soon saw a man emerge from it. It was one of those 2 women, the blonde one, who had uttered the terrible shriek which had echoed throughout the whole hotel, while the other one, a brunette, had given the alarm by pulling on the bell cord with all her might. Mercy! Cried Andrea frantically without seeing the persons to whom he was speaking. Don't call for help! Save me! I won't hurt you! Andrea, the murderer! Cried one of the 2 women. Eugenie, Mademoiselle Danglars! Exclaimed Andrea, passing from fright to stupefaction. Help! Help! Screamed Mademoiselle d'Armilly, taking the bell cord from Eugenie's hands and pulling on it even more violently than her friend had done. Save me! They're after me! Said Andrea, clasping his hands. Don't turn me over to them! It's too late, said Eugenie. They're already on their way up here. Then hide me somewhere. Tell them you were frightened for no good reason. That will turn away their suspicion, and you'll have saved my life. All right, said Eugenie. Go back up the chimney, and we won't say anything. There he is, cried a voice from outside the door. There he is, I see him. The brigadier had put his eye to the keyhole and seen Andrea pleading with the 2 young women. A violent blow from the butt of a musket broke the lock, and the door flew open. Andrea ran to the other door, opening onto the gallery that encircled the courtyard, ready to escape through it. The 2 gendarmes outside fixed him in the sights with their muskets. Andrea stopped short, clutching his useless knife. The brigadier walked up to him with his saber drawn. Come, put that back in its sheath, said Andrea. I'm surrendering, so there's no need to go through all that trouble. And he held out his hands for the handcuffs. Turning to the 2 young women, he smiled imprudently and said, Is there any message you'd like me to deliver to your father, Mademoiselle Eugenie? I'll no doubt be going back to Paris now. Eugenie hid her face with her hands. Oh, there's nothing to be ashamed of, said Andrea, and I don't hold it against you for running after me this way. After all, I was practically your husband, wasn't I? On this jeering note, Andrea left the room, leaving the 2 fugitives to suffer from their shame and the remarks of the assembled crowd. An hour later, they climbed into their carriage and resumed their journey. This time, they were both dressed as women. Andrea was taken back to Paris and imprisoned in the conciergerie.